When most people imagine a medieval castle, they picture towering stone walls, glittering banquets, and powerful nobles dressed in fine silk. But behind the grand halls and heavy wooden doors, there was another world, a quieter world, a world of early mornings, tired feet, and endless responsibility. Because castles did not run on royal power alone. They ran on servants, men, women, and children whose names were rarely written down, yet whose labor kept the entire castle alive. Tonight, we step away from the throne room and into the hidden daily life of castle servants. Chapter 1. The Hidden Engine of the Castle. A medieval castle was not simply a home. It was a complex, constantly moving machine. Even a modest, noble household required dozens of workers to function smoothly. Large royal castles could require well over 100. Servants formed the invisible engine that powered every comfortable moment the nobility enjoyed. Every warm fire in the lord's chamber, every clean sheet on a noble bed, every roasted feast carried into the great hall. All of it depended on human hands working tirelessly behind the scenes. The household was usually organized under a strict chain of command. At the top stood senior officials such as the steward, who managed finances and supplies, and the chamberlain, who oversaw private rooms and domestic order. Below them stretched a wide network of workers. Kitchen staff labored in heat and smoke. Chambermaids moved quietly through private rooms. Stable hands worked outdoors in mud and cold. Laundresses handled endless loads of heavy fabric. Each servant had a defined role, and medieval society valued order above all else. From a young age, many servants understood that this work might define their entire lives. Some entered service as children, especially pages and young helpers, learning discipline early. For the nobility, servants were simply part of daily life. But for the servants themselves, the castle was both workplace and world. Chapter 2. Before dawn, when the work began. The servant's day rarely began with sunrise. It began before it. In the cold, quiet hours of early morning, often around 4 or 5 a.m., the first workers stirred from their shared sleeping spaces. The castle at this hour was dark and still, but not for long. Kitchen workers were usually the first to rise. Their most urgent task was relighting the great hearth fires, which had burned low overnight. This was harder than it sounds. Fire in the medieval world required constant maintenance. Servants had to clear out old ash, arrange kindling, carefully coax flames back to life, carry heavy loads of firewood. Smoke often filled the kitchen as the fires grew stronger. Eyes watered. Clothes absorbed the smell of soot. And this was only the beginning. Water also had to be fetched, usually by hand, from wells or storage barrels. Buckets were heavy, especially when carried repeatedly up narrow stone staircases. By the time the first pale light of morning touched the castle walls, servants had already been working for hours. Chapter 3. The Heat and Pressure of the Castle Kitchen. If the castle had a heart, it was the kitchen. And if any place demanded endurance, it was here. Medieval noble households took food very seriously. Meals were not simple affairs. Even routine dining could involve multiple dishes, especially in wealthier castles. The kitchen was a place of constant motion. Servants chopped vegetables on wooden blocks worn smooth by years of use. Others stirred large iron pots filled with pottage or broth. Near the massive hearth, workers manually turned roasting spits, sometimes for hours, to cook meat evenly over open flames. The heat could be overwhelming. In summer months, the kitchen became almost unbearable. Thick stone walls trapped warmth. Fires roared from early morning until late evening. Burns were common. So were cuts from heavy knives. And yet speed mattered. Because meals had to appear on time in the great hall, fresh, hot, and properly prepared. Mistakes could bring harsh criticism from higher-ranking staff. So kitchen servants worked with intense focus. Day after day, year after year. Chapter 4. The Endless Battle Against Dirt. While the kitchen staff worked in heat and smoke, another group of servants fought a quieter, never-ending battle, cleaning the castle. Despite their grand appearance, medieval castles were surprisingly difficult to keep clean. Floors were often covered with rushes. Dried plant material spread across the ground. Over time, these rushes collected dirt, food scraps, spilled drink, mud from boots. They had to be regularly removed and replaced. Chambermaids and cleaning servants spent long hours sweeping floors with simple brooms made of twigs or straw. There was no running water, no modern soap, no quick solutions. Water had to be carried by hand. Heavy wooden furniture had to be wiped constantly to control dust and soot. And one of the least pleasant tasks was emptying chamber pots. Human waste was a daily reality of castle life, and managing it fell to the lowest-ranking workers. It was unpleasant, unavoidable, and absolutely necessary. In large castles with dozens of rooms, cleaning was never truly finished. Chapter 5. The harsh world of the stables. Beyond the castle's inner warmth, the stable yard was a world of its own. Horses were among the most valuable assets a noble household possessed. They were essential for travel, hunting, warfare, and communication. Keeping them healthy was serious business. Stable hands began work early and often continued until dusk. Their duties included feeding and watering horses, grooming coats and hooves, mucking out stalls, repairing harnesses and saddles, exercising restless animals. The work was physically demanding and often dirty. In winter, the cold could be biting. In wet seasons, the ground turned to deep mud, and horses themselves could be unpredictable. Kicks and bites were real dangers. Yet the smooth running of the household depended heavily on these workers. Because without strong, well-kept horses, a medieval lord's power and mobility were greatly reduced. Chapter 6. Rest, Status, and the Reality of Servant Life. By evening, many servants were exhausted. But the day did not always end cleanly. Even after the great hall quieted and nobles retired, some servants remained on duty. Fires needed tending through the night. Late arrivals required assistance. Unexpected needs could arise at any hour. When servants finally did sleep, accommodations were modest. Most rested in shared spaces, sometimes attic rooms, sometimes near their work areas. Beds were simple. Privacy was rare. But for many medieval workers, service in a castle still offered something valuable. Stability, regular meals, shelter within strong walls. In a world where famine, war, and disease were constant threats, that security mattered. And so generation after generation continued to serve, quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. Chapter 7. The Social Hierarchy Among Servants. Although servants lived far below the nobility in medieval society, their own world inside the castle was far from equal. Within the servant class itself, there existed a strict and carefully observed hierarchy. At the very top stood the senior household officers, individuals such as the steward, the chamberlain, and the master cook. These men, and occasionally women, held positions of real authority. They managed supplies, supervised lower staff, and acted as intermediaries between the noble family and the workforce. Below them were the skilled servants. These included experienced cooks, senior chambermaids, head stable masters, and trusted personal attendants. Skilled workers often enjoyed slightly better living conditions and, more importantly, greater job security. Years of loyal service could slowly elevate a servant's standing within the household. At the very bottom were the youngest and newest workers. Pages, scullery boys, laundry assistants, and general laborers performed the most physically demanding and least pleasant tasks. These workers carried heavy loads, scrubbed floors on their hands and knees, and handled the dirtiest responsibilities of castle life. Movement between ranks was possible, but slow. Promotion usually depended on three things: loyalty, endurance, and the favor of superiors. One mistake, however, could undo years of careful service. Inside the castle walls, reputation was everything. Chapter 8. The Role of Young Pages and Child Servants. Many people imagine medieval servants as fully grown adults. But in truth, castles were filled with children at work. Young boys, known as pages, often entered noble households between the ages of 7 and 14. For sons of minor noble families, service as a page could be the first step toward knighthood. But for children of lower status, service was simply work. Pages performed a wide range of duties. They carried messages through long corridors, served food in the great hall, assisted senior servants, ran errands across the castle grounds, and learned, very quickly, the discipline expected inside noble households. The work could be exhausting for such young workers. Days were long. Expectations were strict. Mistakes were corrected firmly. Yet service in a castle also offered something rare in the medieval world: training, observation, and sometimes, though not always, opportunity. A clever and well-behaved page might eventually rise to a more respected position, but many remained in service their entire lives, growing older within the same stone walls where they first began. Chapter 9: Feast Days, when the pressure doubled. If ordinary days in the castle were busy, feast days were overwhelming. Medieval nobles loved grand celebrations, religious holidays, visiting dignitaries, military victories, weddings. All could trigger enormous feasts that required the entire servant staff to work at full capacity. Preparation often began days in advance. Kitchen workers processed vast amounts of food. Animals were slaughtered. Bread was baked in huge batches. Ale and wine were carefully prepared and stored. On the day of the feast itself, the castle transformed. The great hall filled with long wooden tables. Tapestries were hung. Candles multiplied, casting warm, flickering light across the stone walls. For the nobles, it was a night of music and abundance. For the servants, it was one of the most stressful days imaginable. Kitchen staff worked in near constant motion. Servers moved carefully through crowded halls carrying heavy platters. Spills or mistakes in front of high-ranking guests could bring severe consequences. And when the feast finally ended, the work was not over, because everything still had to be cleaned. Chapter 10: The endless labor of the laundry workers. Among the most physically demanding roles in the castle was one often overlooked: the laundresses. Medieval laundry was nothing like modern washing. There were no machines, no electric dryers, no easy detergents. Instead, washing clothes and linens was a slow, exhausting manual process. Water had to be heated over open fires. Heavy fabric had to be soaked, scrubbed, beaten, and rinsed repeatedly. Large noble households generated enormous amounts of laundry: bedsheets, table linens, undergarments, work clothes, towels and cloths. Wet fabric was extremely heavy, and laundresses worked with it for hours at a time. Their hands often became rough and cracked from constant exposure to water and lye-based soaps. In winter, the work was especially miserable: cold air, cold water, cold stone floors. Yet clean linens were a visible sign of noble wealth and order, so the work never stopped. Chapter 11: Servants and the Animals of the Castle. Castles were not only filled with people, they were filled with animals, and many servants were responsible for their care. Beyond the horses in the stables, castles commonly housed hunting dogs, guard dogs, pigeons and dovecots, occasionally hawks or falcons for noble hunting. Animal care required constant attention. Dogs needed feeding and exercise. Birds required careful handling and specialized diets. Kennels and coops had to be cleaned regularly. In noble households that prized hunting, the condition of their animals reflected directly on the lord's prestige. This placed quiet pressure on the servants responsible, because a sick hunting dog or an injured falcon could reflect poorly on the entire household staff. Chapter 12: Quiet Moments and Rare Freedoms. Despite the long hours and heavy responsibilities, servant life was not entirely without moments of relief. Late in the evening, when major tasks were finally complete, some servants experienced brief periods of personal time. In shared quarters, workers might talk quietly about the day, share simple food, mend clothing, or simply rest tired feet. On certain religious holidays, servants sometimes received reduced duties or small celebrations of their own. These moments were modest, but meaningful, because medieval servant life was defined by routine, by structure, by repetition, and so even small breaks from that rhythm could feel significant. Yet everyone knew morning would come quickly, and with it, another long day inside the castle walls. And so, as the great castle finally falls silent, as the last candle flickers low against the stone walls, and the noble family sleeps peacefully in their private chambers, somewhere in the shadows of that vast fortress, a servant is still awake, perhaps tending a dying fire, perhaps finishing one last chore, perhaps simply resting tired hands after a day that began before the sun itself. History often remembers the kings, the queens, the battles and the crowns, but the true rhythm of castle life was carried on the shoulders of people whose names were rarely written down. They cooked the feasts, they cleaned the halls, they cared for the horses, They kept the great machine of the castle quietly moving. Day after day, year after year, mostly unseen, almost never celebrated. Yet without them, the castle could not function. The candles would go out, the fires would fade, and the grand halls would grow very, very quiet. Tonight, we remember the invisible lives that history almost forgot. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next journey into the past. Bye, we will meet again.